And yeah, we're really excited about Hilde's talk, as Tara was just commenting on, especially because it's so incredibly relevant to the well, it's obviously all about the South African setting and about how South African Bantu languages relate to each other, which is really an important topic. And there's actually really not as much work on this as should be. So we're all really excited to hear the presentation today. And to also look at some of the other work Hilde has published on this topic. So Hilde Gunnink is currently a postdoc at the University of Ghent, where she also completed her PhD in 2018. So she's quite a young researcher, but one with very impressive and very interesting publications on a lot of topics, especially on Bantu languages and Khoisan languages and the contact between the two. And so after writing a grammar of Fue for her PhD, she has been doing various other projects on this kind of general area, and the current one is looking at the past and present of Bantu languages, looking at microtypology, historical comparative linguistics, and lexicography. And I think that's all I'm going to say. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, and also for having been a fantastic participant. I think you have been at every single presentation we've had so far. So we have also noticed how involved you have been in collaborating with this webinar. So thank you, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm afraid I did miss a few, but I'm glad that wasn't noticed too much. Yeah, so thank you for this opportunity to present here. I'll happily agree that I think that this is a topic that's very relevant for people working in Southern African linguistics, and I'm also very excited to hear your opinions as specialists on Southern African Bantu languages, individual languages, groups of languages, what you think about these ideas. So this talk is about the classification and subclassification of Bantu languages of Southern Africa. And the main goal of this research is not so much to come to a classification, but to understand what that classification tells us about the history of these languages, and by association, the history of their speakers, of the communities that speak these languages now and in the past. So classification, putting everything in the right box, is not necessarily my primary goal. I'm just using classification as a tool to understand how these languages developed over time, because this can give us insights into a part of history which we otherwise don't know that much about. The most languages of Southern Africa belong to the Bantu language family. It's also called Ntu or Sintu, but especially outside South Africa, the term Bantu is the more commonly used in academia. And by Bantu, we just mean we just use it as the name of a language family. I know that in South Africa, it has other associations, which is also why different names have been proposed. And the Bantu languages form a subfamily of the Niger-Congo languages. So in the map here, you can see the Niger-Congo languages in red, with the Bantu languages in slightly lighter shade of red. And that shows you that the area of Africa where Bantu languages are spoken is fairly large. Pretty much everywhere in Africa below the equator, you will find communities speaking Bantu languages. And also in Southern Africa nowadays, the vast majority of Southern Africans speak one or more Bantu languages as their mother language. So these are clearly the dominant languages in South Africa, in Southern Africa. And we know that these Bantu languages of Southern Africa, that they are closely related. It's been clear for a very long time to both speakers and to outsiders who study these languages that they share a common history. So the languages of the Bantu languages of Southern Africa are usually divided into 6 groups. And as I'm sure everyone who has ever worked on Bantu languages is aware, when we talk about Bantu languages, we classify them into so-called zones. And these zones are designated by a letter, and most of the languages, at least of the eastern part of Southern Africa, which is what I will focus on, belong to the so-called Zone S. Now, being part of Zone S doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that these languages are more closely related to each other than they are to others, although, as I am going to argue here for the Southern Bantu languages, for the Zone S languages, that is actually the case. So there are 6 subgroups among the Zone S languages, which I will call Southern Bantu. There's the Shona languages, spoken in the north, mostly in Zimbabwe. There's Venda, which is basically just one language, although with some dialectal variation, which is spoken on the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe. There's the Sotho languages or Sotho-Tswana languages. There's the Nguni languages, mostly spoken in the east of South Africa. There's a fairly small group of Tsonga languages, with Xitsonga being the most well-known, spoken in both South Africa and Mozambique. And then there's a very small group, basically just 2 small languages called Chopi, and these are spoken only in Mozambique. So it's been clear for a very long time that the Bantu languages form a single family, that they share a lot, that they have a lot of shared linguistic characteristics. But what has been less clear is how languages within the Bantu language family relate to each other. And one of the most recent proposals for subclassification of Southern Bantu languages confirmed what has been suggested before, that there is a very large but fairly homogeneous eastern branch of Bantu. So these are the languages marked in brown on the map, and you see them, this brown colored branch in the tree, in the phylogenetic tree. So these are basically all the languages from Eastern Africa all the way down to most of Southern Africa. And they form a fairly coherent language family. And it's been for a long time assumed that the Southern African Bantu language are part of this Eastern branch, meaning that their closest relatives are spoken further in the northeast in places like Mozambique, Tanzania, possibly the east of Zambia as well. So we know that the Southern Bantu languages are part of Eastern Bantu. We've also known for quite a while that Southern Bantu languages fall into these 6 distinct clusters. But there's also a lot that we don't know about the classification of Southern Bantu yet. For instance, we don't know whether all Southern Bantu languages form a single group, whether they share a single common ancestor, the so-called Proto-Southern Bantu, which is not shared with any other Southern Bantu languages. So we don't know whether they form a single group or whether they form a group with Bantu languages outside Southern Africa. We also don't know how these different Southern Bantu clusters relate to each other. So we know there's 6 of them, but we don't know whether there's some that are more closely related to each other than to others. What we also don't know much about is how languages within each of these clusters relate to each other. So this is what we set out to discover. So this research that I'm presenting here is part of a study that I did with Natalia Jusupolidori, who is an evolutionary biologist, and my colleague Koen Postun. And it's actually published in Language Dynamics and Change. So if anyone wants to look it up, it gives you all the background to what I'm discussing here. And what we did for our Southern Bantu classification is we sampled 81 Bantu languages. They're indicated with red dots here on the map. And we picked as many Southern Bantu languages as we could find data on. So we ended up with 34 Southern Bantu languages, which is not all Southern Bantu languages, but that's everything we could find somewhat reliable data for. And for these 81 languages, we collected a 100-word list of concepts that we thought would be fairly basic. So these are words like person, or the verb to go, or the word for house. So words that you expect to exist in all these languages, and also words that you expect to be so basic that they are fairly resistant to borrowing. and also words that we expected to find even in the languages which are not well documented, which are quite a few, especially in the Southern African area. So we collected the words in all these languages for these 100 concepts, and we sorted them into cognate sets. And then we created a phylogenetic tree using Bayesian inference methods. And this phylogenetic tree of the 81 Bantu languages that we sampled looks something like this. Okay, a lot of detail and a lot of detail that's not necessarily relevant here. So basically, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the root of the tree, so the position of Proto-Bantu presumably, is at the top left. And then we have a number of early branches, and these are Bantu languages spoken in the northwest of the Bantu-speaking area, which, as we expected, are clearly not closely related to Southern Bantu languages, would not make any geographic sense. Southern Bantu languages are found all the way at the bottom of this tree. And as you can see, they are part of this huge branch here, this huge cluster, which includes languages that have been previously classified as Eastern Bantu. So we did find Southern Bantu to be part of Eastern Bantu. Now, zooming in to the Southern Bantu classification specifically, we see that those 6 traditionally recognized clusters show up in our classification as well. So we have the Shona languages, which form a single branch. We have Venda, which is a single branch. All the languages traditionally subsumed under Sotho form a single branch. It's the same is true for the Chopi languages, the Tsonga languages, and the Nguni languages. So these traditionally recognized clusters are clearly well supported in our lexicon-based phylogeny as well. But we also find some insights on how these clusters relate to each other. So we find fairly clear support for the close relationship between the Chopi languages, so the ones spoken in Mozambique, and the Tsonga languages. So clearly they seem to be forming a cluster together. There also seems to be a closer relationship between the Nguni languages and this Tsonga Chopi cluster. But we're not entirely sure about that. Without going too much into the details of the method, what this method basically does is it calculates the likelihood of these a large number of different trees, a large number of different classifications. And what this number of 91 represents is that in 91% of the trees it generated, these language groups, these clusters, formed a single branch, which is not entirely convincing. So there might be other reasons, there might be other types of signal that caused the Nguni languages and the Tsonga Chopi languages to be grouped together. We know that there has been a lot of contact between at least some Nguni languages and Tsonga languages. So it could be that that contact resulted in some shared vocabulary that our method reinterpreted as inheritance. So I also wanted to point out that the Shona languages, so the languages spoken in Zimbabwe, form a sister clade with all South African languages. So basically what that means is if you have the ancestor of all Southern Bantu languages here, the first group to diverge are the Shona languages. So the other 5 groups all share more with each other than they do with the Shona languages. Now, there's another hypothesis that we wanted to test with this phylogeny, and that is earlier suggestions that the Makua languages share some similarities to Southern Bantu. Makua languages are not spoken in Southern Africa at all. They're spoken in northern Mozambique, and they're therefore geographically quite far removed from Southern Bantu. But earlier research has shown that Makua languages share a number of remarkable sound changes with Southern Bantu, and these sound changes are especially shared with languages of the Sotho group. So one of these changes that you see in both Makua and in certain Southern languages is the change from reconstructed t to r, so a change from a stop to a trill. So you see that with reflexes with the word for buffalo, which is reconstructed with t as its second consonant. And in Makua, the word for buffalo is enari. And in Tonga, you get nyari. Venda has nari. Sotho language has nari. So in all these languages, you have t changing to r. Also in the second example, the word for fat or oil has r as its second root consonant in all these languages. There are also a number of sound changes that Makua only seems to share with the Sotho languages. And this is the change of prenasalized voiceless stops, so p, d, and k, to aspirated stops without any prenasalization. So this is a loss of prenasalization, and instead there's aspiration. So you see that in word for wind, which is ipeo in Makua and pefo in Sotho. So in both cases, you get p. Similarly, for the word for person, but both Makua and Sotho here have an aspirated but not prenasalized t. But the most remarkable sound change that you see in both Makua and Sotho is the change of the prenasalized voiced plosives, so mb, nd, and ng. In both Makua and Sotho, they change to p, t, and k. So they lose their voicing and they also lose their nasal. So the verb for making pottery in Makua is upa and in Sotho is bupa. So you see that there are other differences, for instance, Makua having lost the initial b, but you see that the change from mb to p takes place in both languages. Same with the word for goat, the word for to walk, and the word for horn. So this seems to suggest that there is a close link between Southern Bantu languages, particularly Sotho languages, and Makua. The change from t to r and the change of the voiceless prenasalized plosives, so p and k, these are not, you see them in certain other Bantu languages as well. They're not necessarily unique, but the change of the voiced prenasalized plosives, so the b and g, to the voiceless non-prenasalized plosives, is not seen anywhere else in Bantu languages, at least not that I'm familiar with. It's also a sound change that's hard to motivate phonetically. It's difficult to see what kind of phonetic motivation lies behind this kind of change. So the fact that this happened in two distinct groups suggests that there is some kind of common history. And in earlier studies, it has been suggested that Makua genealogically belongs to the Southern Bantu languages as well. So we tested this in our phylogeny. We included two Makua languages that we could get data on, two Makua varieties, basically Central Makua and Makua Nahara, which are grouped together as we would have expected, but they are not closely related to the Southern Bantu languages. Their closest relatives are other languages spoken in northern Mozambique and southern Tanzania. So at least in our lexicon-based classification, we couldn't find any evidence for a close link between Southern Bantu or Sotho and Makua. Instead, we suggest that there might have been a possible shared substrate, because we do still think that these sound changes are remarkable enough that it makes more sense to assume that they did not arise twice completely without any connection. So what might have happened is that these sound changes arose in both the Sotho languages and the Makua languages because they were in contact with a similar language group. Well, we can't really substantiate this any further. We have no idea what kind of language that would have been, but that would be one way of accounting for this phonological similarity that you otherwise don't really see reflected in the lexicon. So this phylogenetic classification gives some insight into how different clusters of Southern Bantu relate to each other, but it also gives some insight into how languages within each cluster relate to each other. And I want to look at that in a little more detail for the Nguni cluster. So the Nguni languages, these include 4 languages that are official in South Africa: isiZulu, isiXhosa, isiSwati, and isiNdebele. But there's a lot more Nguni languages than just the 4 official ones. There's minority languages like Patra, Hlangwini, Lala. There's Northern Ndebele or Sindebele. There's Puti. There's also Ndebele that is spoken in Zimbabwe. There are possibly, or maybe there were other Nguni languages as well, but this is everything that we could get some data on. So I've zoomed in on the Nguni portion of the classification. So that shows us how presumably Nguni languages are related to each other, suggesting that Puti is the most divergent of the Nguni languages, followed by Northern Ndebele and Southern Ndebele. So these are the 2 Ndebele spoken in South Africa. It also suggests that the closest relative of Zimbabwean Ndebele, so Ndebele variety spoken in Zimbabwe, is not Zulu, but actually Swati. So we're not first to look at Nguni subclassification. Earlier proposals have mainly been based on 2 things. There has been classification based on sound changes, and there's been earlier lexico-statistic classification. So these also make use of cognacy in the basic lexicon, but their methodology is a bit different from ours. So looking at sound changes, Nguni languages have been divided into so-called Zunda and Tekela languages. And the main difference between Zunda Nguni and Tekela Nguni is that Zunda languages use z, where Tekela languages use t. So where Zulu has umzali for parents, Swati has umtali. And based on this criterion, you could see that Zulu, Xhosa, Zimbabwean Ndebele, and isiNdebele are Zunda languages, and the other Nguni languages are Tekela languages. So this seems to be applied quite regularly and might therefore be a nice way of classifying Nguni languages. Another change, another phonological correspondence between Zunda languages and Tekela languages is that Zundu languages use t, so an aspirated plosive, where Tekela languages use either an aspirated affricate or a heterogenic affricate, so tf. So where Zulu uses t as in uluti, Swati has lutsi, so with an affricate. And which affricate it is depends, for some languages, depends on the following vowel. So for Swati, Puti, and Patra, it depends, you have ts when the following vowel is a non-back vowel, and you have tf, so an alveolar, labio-alveolar, I'm not even sure how to call this, a heterogenic affricate at least, when the following vowel is a back vowel. You don't get that that same kind of allophony in Lala, Northern Ndebele, and Hlangwini. In fact, in Lala, you don't get any allophony at all. And in Northern Ndebele and Hlangwini, which are Tekela languages under the criterion that they use t instead of z, you don't get this t and or tf at all. You just get the same kind of t that you get in the Zunda languages. Same thing goes for the use of d in Zunda. This corresponds to z or dv in Tekela languages. And again, you can see that Northern Ndebele and Hlangwini don't agree with this particular sound change, so they don't pattern with the rest of the Tekela languages. Okay, so we took this Z-T correspondence, this Zunda-Tekela correspondence, and we mapped it onto our phylogeny, and it's a bit of a mess. So the languages, the so-called Zunda languages don't group together at all in our phylogeny, and the so-called Tekela languages don't group together either. So you often see that languages that are considered very closely related to each other in our phylogeny, like Swati and Zimbabwean Ndebele or Patra and Xhosa, one of them is Tekela and one of them is Zunda. It has also been noted that this Zunda-Tekela correspondence, this use of t instead of z, goes beyond Nguni alone. So in the languages of the Tsonga and Chopi groups, so the ones here at the bottom, you always get t instead of z. So this seems to be a change that's not so much definitive of Nguni, but that might have, but that has spread through a much larger cluster as well. So the fact that these two changes, the zeta change and the third change, don't necessarily map onto each other, and the fact that they don't map onto this lexicon-based phylogeny suggests that maybe some of these sound changes rather spread aerially. Another earlier classification of Nguni languages is a lexicostatistic classification, so also looks at cognacy in the basic lexicon. But one of the main differences between lexicostatistics and our phylogenetic method is that lexicostatistics tends to treat innovations and retentions equally. Maybe that's a technical detail that we don't need to go into, that we don't need to discuss now, but feel free to ask me about this later if you like. So there are expected to be, so the data are similar, but the method is a bit different. There are expected to be some differences. There's an earlier lexicostatistic classification of Nguni languages, which had fairly similar findings to ours. So I'll explain some of these abbreviations. So it also found Puti and Northern Ndebele to be some of the earliest branches of the Nguni languages. But its main difference with our classification is the classification of Lala. So Lala in this classification is either the first branch to split off or is splits off at the second or the third node. So it seems to be in this lexicostatistic classification, Lala seems to be a fairly divergent language. Whereas in our classification, we have two Lala varieties, and they seem to group together with Ntlangwini in this much larger cluster that also includes languages like Xhosa and Zulu and Swati. And the possible explanation for this strange classification of Lala is that Lala is somewhat of an enigmatic language. It might not be, and there's an entire paper on the word Lala and what it refers to, but it might not necessarily refer to a language as a linguistic construct, that it might be more of an ethnic label or even a social label. So it might refer to a particular social group, and they might not necessarily speak a distinct language from other social groups. So depending on how you define Lala, that also depends on where you classify it. So the position of the two Lalas. Okay, so having classified these Southern Bantu languages, what does this tell us about the history of the people who speak these languages? Well, first of all, Southern Bantu is a subgroup of Eastern Bantu. That's not our finding. That has been assumed for a long time, and we've only confirmed it. That means that Southern Bantu speakers would have migrated to Southern Africa from a northeastern direction. So they probably passed through places like Mozambique and Tanzania. We also found that all Southern Bantu languages share a single direct common ancestor. So that means that they form a group together, which doesn't include any other Eastern Bantu languages. Now, from this, we posit that the ancestor of these Southern Bantu languages probably originated in Southern Africa. Do I have a map here? Yeah. So if you map the current distribution of these 6 subgroups, and you look at the area where all these 6 subgroups overlap, then this box, black box in area here is probably the area where Proto-Southern Bantu was once spoken before it started to diverge into the different languages we see today. So we compared our data to what is known in the archaeological record about the history of Southern African Bantu-speaking communities. Interestingly, so from archaeology, it is quite clear that the first Bantu-speaking communities probably entered Southern Africa around 300 AD. It's obviously difficult to directly link archaeological remains to languages, and I'll be happy to go into that in more detail if you like. But the earliest arrival of Bantu speakers is dated to the beginning of the first millennium AD. But the archaeological record also shows a clear break between the first millennium and the second millennium. There's sort of three pottery traditions that arise in the first millennium that are associated with Bantu-speaking communities. And two of these pottery traditions disappear after the first millennium to be replaced by new pottery traditions that actually are ancestral to the pottery traditions of modern-day Bantu-speaking communities of Southern Africa. But one of these three pottery traditions, which is called Kalundu, did not disappear, but persisted among modern-day Shona speakers. So these pottery traditions are remained in Zimbabwe. So from this archaeological picture, earlier conclusions suggested that there were separate migrations of Shona speakers, ancestors of Shona speakers in the first millennium, and ancestors of other Southern Bantu speakers in the second millennium. However, this is difficult to reconcile with our linguistics situation, which rather suggests that Shona, together with the other Southern Bantu languages, derive from a single common ancestor. In fact, an ancestor that was most likely spoken within Southern Africa. So from linguistics, we don't see this evidence for a separate migration of Shona speakers and other Southern Bantu speakers. Rather, we interpret this situation as a case of spread over spread. This has also been recently suggested for the spread of Bantu-speaking communities in Central Africa through the Congo rainforest. What we think might have happened is that the Bantu-speaking communities of the first millenniums of the early Iron Age spoke some kind of presumably Eastern Bantu language, but that they lost their language, that they stopped speaking this language when new migrants arrived in the second millennium. So we think that there would have been two migrations, one in the first millennium and one in the second millennium, and that Southern Bantu languages as spoken today only derive from the languages that arrived through the migration at the start of the second millennium. And that there was already a migration in the first millennium, but that the languages that were spoken by those communities disappeared when the new migrants arrived, possibly because the new migrants arrived. There might very well have been language shift from the earlier Bantu-speaking communities to the new migrants. This would have involved loss of the languages of the first millennium Bantu speakers, but also loss of their material heritage, because as the archaeological record tells us, their pottery traditions died out. They would have been different for Shona-speaking communities. We expect them to have maintained their material heritage, but they would have shifted to the languages of the newcomers, explaining why Shona groups with the rest of Southern Bantu. So this means that whatever languages were spoken in the first millennium in Southern Africa were subsequently lost. Presumably because the community speaking these languages shifted to the languages of the newcomers. One way of testing this more thoroughly would be to look at linguistic evidence for a potential substrate. So to see if we can find any trace of this earlier Bantu language, this first millennium Bantu language, as survived in the languages that replaced them during the second millennium. And there actually are quite a few, and this is obviously a difficult undertaking because you're looking for loans, you're looking for traces from presumably related language. But there have been suggestions that such a Bantu substrate can be found in certain Nguni languages. And it can be identified by the fact that the sound changes that these words have undergone are not the sound changes that the majority of words in these Nguni languages have undergone. So it seems to be that Nguni languages have inherited Bantu words in which their regular sound changes apply, and then they have a separate set of words that also have a Bantu origin, but that have undergone a different kind of sound change. So for instance, we have a Xhosa word udaka for mud, which seems to come from a reconstructed root daka. But the usual reflex of reconstructed t in Xhosa is not d, it's t. So this looks like it's cognate, but it's not a regular reflex. So that might be because it's borrowed from another language that has undergone a separate set of sound changes. So there's quite a few of these words. Their semantics is also interesting. For instance, the word for to fish seems to fit this particular kind of sound changes. So that might tell us something about the subsistence strategy of these first millennium Bantu-speaking communities. But this definitely requires a lot more research in order to investigate whether this is really a trace of an earlier Bantu substrate. Another factor that played a big role in the history of Southern Bantu languages and their diversification is contacts. Because when Bantu speakers arrived in Southern Africa, the main languages that were spoken there at the time presumably belonged to the so-called Khoisan language phylum, which is actually a group of 3 different language families that are characterized by their use of click phonemes. And these click phonemes have also been borrowed into certain Southern African Bantu languages. And they're a very clear case of contact-induced change in Southern Bantu languages, because they're typical of Khoisan. You don't find them in Bantu languages outside Southern Africa, and in fact, you don't find them in any languages elsewhere at all. They're only found in African languages, and within African languages only in 2 very distinct regions in Eastern and Southern Africa. So this is a very clear case of Khoisan influence in Southern Bantu languages. I might not have time to explain exactly the case of nominal suffixes, but let me see if we can do this quickly. So another clear case, or another case that has been argued quite extensively of Khoisan influence on Southern Bantu, is the use of nominal suffixes. So certain Southern Bantu languages make use of suffixes on a noun to express concepts like locative, diminutive, and feminine. Whereas in languages outside Southern, Bantu languages outside Southern Africa, these concepts are usually expressed differently. So with locatives and diminutives, languages outside Southern Bantu typically do that with prefixes, and feminine outside Southern Bantu is typically expressed either through a prefix or through some kind of periphrastic construction, making use of a noun meaning female. Okay. But in Southern Bantu languages, you have nominal suffixes, at least in some languages, that express these notions. So what we did is we took these features from Khoisan languages that have been established in Southern Bantu languages, and we mapped them onto a simplified version of our phylogeny. Showing that these Khoisan-derived features were incorporated at different points in time. So, for instance, a locative suffix is found in Venda, Sotho, Nguni, Chopi, and Tsonga. So that might have been an innovation that already happened at the ancestral stage of all these languages. Diminutive suffixes are used in Sotho, Nguni, Chopi, and Tsonga. So that might be an innovation that defines this particular node. Click phonemes are found in all but one of the Nguni languages, and I actually have a separate paper arguing that clicks can be reconstructed to Proto-Nguni as well. So this suggests that the contact between Southern Bantu and Khoisan languages, which we know took place, is probably located at different points in history. Some contact-induced changes go way back. Some of them only go back to the ancestral stage of a particular cluster, like Proto-Nguni, and there's even contact-induced changes in individual languages, so that are not shared with the entire cluster. And most interestingly, there are no Khoisan-derived features that we can reliably posit for Proto-Southern Bantu. So apparently, contact with Khoisan speakers did not take place at the Proto-Southern Bantu stage, or at least didn't lead to lasting linguistic changes. So it's likely that Bantu Khoisan contact was initiated after the breakup of Proto-Southern Bantu, but that it continued in different ways and at different stages up to recent history, and in some areas even up to today. It also shows that certain of these Khoisan-derived features were actually developed multiple times. So, for instance, we see clicks in the Guni languages, but we also see them in 2 languages of the Sotho cluster. So those seem to represent separate contact events. Same goes for the development of a feminine suffix that's only been described for 3 separate languages and might therefore be 3 separate borrowing events. And that this kind of parallel development might suggest that they have that there is a shared donor language, so that these different Southern Bantu languages were in contact with a similar Khoisan language, or at least a similar Khoisan language family. Yeah, okay, let's not go into that. So there's also evidence from genetic studies that give us more insight into the kind of Khoisan Bantu interactions that took place and when they took place specifically. Okay, so what can this kind of classification tell us? It suggests that Southern Bantu languages and their speakers arrived in Southern Africa during the late Iron Age, so during the 2nd millennium, after which they started to differentiate. And when they arrived there, they were probably not the first Bantu-speaking communities to settle in Southern Africa. So it shows us that the settlement history of Southern Africa is probably very complex and included multiple waves of migrations at different times. It also shows us that different Bantu languages were affected by Khoisan contact to different degrees and also in different times. So it also shows us that the history of Bantu Khoisan contact is layered and shows some big chronological differences. This also creates a lot of new questions, for instance. If you understand more about Khoisan influence in Bantu, we can also do a better job at linking it in time. There's a number of other cases of possible Khoisan influence on Southern Bantu that I would like to argue, but it's difficult to find good evidence for. What also definitely needs further attention is to look at linguistic evidence for this spread over spread scenario that we are proposing. So this idea that there were multiple migrations into Southern Africa of Bantu-speaking communities. And one way, I mean, obviously archaeology and genetics have some kind of say in this, but the way to address this from a linguistic point of view would to look for this kind of earlier Bantu substrate in Southern Bantu languages. So there's lots more interesting questions that we could possibly answer in this field. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be many comments and questions. I'll wait a second to see who wants to go first. Martin, go ahead and welcome. Nice to see you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Hilde. Very interesting talk. I have a question. Is it a question? You argued that for the Makua and the Sotho groups that there was an extra language, you don't know anything about it, that formed a substrate. That means that you've ruled out other options, that they've influenced each other. I can follow that, but can you still make it explicit why it should be an extra influence substrate rather than Sotho influencing Makua or Makua influencing Sotho?
Well, I think the upside of the substrate hypothesis is that it explains why this sound change happens at all, because it's a strange kind of sound change. If it were, if it had a better phonetic motivation, we would expect to see it more often. But especially the b to p change, you don't see that anywhere. And I think one of the ways you could explain this kind of set of sound changes is if you assume that there's a sort of substrate of a language that doesn't allow prenasalization, but has a three-way voice onset contrast. So contrast aspirated, voiceless, and voiced plosives, but doesn't allow any combinations of nasals and plosives. And I think if you posit that kind of substrate, then you would get the kind of changes that you see in both Sotho and Makua. I think the problem with a real Sotho-Makua contact is that they're not close to each other at all. And we assume that some kind of language was spoken in all of these areas before these languages came in. For Sotho languages, we obviously have some idea on the kind of languages that were spoken in this area. They would have been Khoisan languages. For Makua, we have no trace. So it might very well have been a kind of language that is related to the languages that were found in Southern Africa. But obviously the weakness of this whole hypothesis is we can't possibly prove it. We have no idea of what that substrate would have looked like. And we have no idea, no way of getting evidence of it.
Thank you. I have more questions for later, maybe.
Great. Then there's somebody from the interpreting center. I think they don't have a video camera on the computer, but please unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi, Hilda. My name is Adma Piri. There's a point that where you talk about Zimbabwean Ndebele, and you say that it's close to Swati, not Zulu. I think as Zimbabwean Ndebele is closer to Zulu than Swati, because I think they share almost probably 96% of the lexicon. And also, I'm Ndebele, I'm a Ndebele speaker, Zimbabwean Ndebele speaker, and I think, yeah, there's a paper by, is it Rycroft or 1980, where he talks about, he argues that the difference between Zulu and Ndebele are minimal when considering tone and the pronunciation of vowels and consonants. He maintains that Ndebele has retained the proto-forms of pronunciation, while the Zulu has changed it from Proto-Zulu, Proto-Nguni. And also, I remember growing up, I mean, when I went to high school or primary school, we used more like Zulu grammar books, not Swati grammar books. So I think it's closer to Zulu than Swati.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that was a very surprising result for me as well. And the classification doesn't necessarily show, it also shows a very close relationship to Zimbabwean Ndebele and Zulu. I wonder if the reason why Zulu is usually seen as the closest relative of Zimbabwean Ndebele has to do with, like you said, has to do with pronunciation. So Zulu and Zimbabwean Ndebele both are Zunda languages, whereas Swati is a Tekela language. So Swati sounds quite different, but in our classification, we only looked at cognacy in the lexicon. So it could be that Swati and Zimbabwean Ndebele share more lexicon, but they share fewer sound changes. So it might sound different, even though the lexicon might be more similar. And I was wondering if another possible explanation for the apparent similarity between Zulu and Zimbabwean Ndebele is that possibly Zulu is just better known, and maybe Zulu textbooks were used because there are more Zulu textbooks. Maybe Swati textbooks might make more sense, but they don't exist, or maybe there's just a tradition of assuming. I mean, they're obviously very closely related. You obviously made do with Zulu textbooks really well, so it doesn't really matter if Swati is even closer, if Zulu is close enough to work with. Oh. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, Jochen, you get the next question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much for this very interesting talk. I certainly learned a lot. I also was surprised by this finding regarding Zimbabwean and Ndebele and isiZulu. Just one more comment about this. I also thought historically that the Ndebele spoken in Zimbabwe was actually carried there by people who came from Natal. So my very limited knowledge of the history is that it was some kind of former military leader from Shaka who had a conflict with Shaka and then moved to Zimbabwe to take basically what I thought of as isiZulu with him, and then that sort of turned into Zimbabwean and Ndebele. So that's one comment or question about the sort of influence of this kind of historical data on your findings. And then just a comment about the idea that locative and diminutive suffixes originate from Khoisan. I'm sure or I assume that you know that paper by Tom Gilderman, where he argues that these suffixes were incorporated into Bantu more in the northeast area. I saw that you had it on your last slide, I think, about this influence from non-Bantu languages on Eastern Bantu languages, and so that the suffixes developed further north and then were carried into South Africa with the migration. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the nominal suffix situation is more complex than I discussed it now. Also because the diminutives are quite restricted to Southern Africa, but the locatives are also found in Eastern Africa. So this is an areal feature that goes beyond just Southern Africa. Although the feminine suffixes, there are good arguments to assume that that's really a Khoisan-derived influence. Yeah, about the Swati Ndebele link. I think that generally the events of the 19th century have probably very radically changed the Nguni linguistic landscape. So what people meant by Zulu back then and what is understood by Zulu now might have changed quite a lot. And I think, I don't know much about, I don't think anyone is able to reconstruct what Nguni languages looked like before all these things happened. But we do know that it must have influenced it quite a lot. And I don't know how useful, yeah, I've no idea what languages would have looked like before then. I see that this Swati Ndebele issue is raising a lot of questions. So I think we might have to go back to our data and see what exactly it is that caused Swati Ndebele to be grouped closer together. Maybe there's a way to explain it.
Thank you. And that would have been my follow-up question. So if you can think of any particular linguistic phenomenon that would show that in that respect, Swati is more closely linked to Zimbabwean and Ndebele than isiZulu is. I don't know if you can think of any or if that is in your data at all, but that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is only based on 100 lexical items. And so the change cannot be huge, but there might be one very specific lexical innovations that they happen to share that is very telling. So, but we still need to run another test to identify those actual lexical innovations that the program is using to create these trees. So when we do, we could maybe explain why this surprising result originated from.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give myself a chance to also ask questions. So maybe my first question is, well, I'll start with the proper linguistic question. So from what you were saying, it sounds a bit like maybe it doesn't make sense to think of Zunda and Tequila as actual groups, right? Or do you think that's too far based on the current results?
I think that they're not so much, I don't think we need to think about them in terms of historical groups. I don't think there was a particular point in history where the Zunda innovation took place and the Tequila innovation took place, or one of them was a retention probably. And that's when the two languages split into separate groups, never to change again. But I do think that it's, I mean, one of the reasons why I think it might not be historically so relevant is that this is a kind of change that people are very aware of. And there's also verbs like tequila, which means to speak with this particular fashion. So it seems to be that this is something that people might even be able to change quite easily if they come into contact with another group using this particular feature, or maybe if they want to distinguish themselves from another group that uses this particular feature. So I don't think it's relevant in terms of classification purposes, but it might tell us something about languages that have been in contact with each other and this kind of sound change spreading through contact. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then, so I'm a little bit reluctant to ask this, but I'm curious about it. So, I mean, you've talked about archaeological evidence specifically from pottery,
And I was wondering, so does that mean there's no hope amongst your sort of broader research team also, maybe as far as you would know that, whether there's any additional insights from other types of archaeological evidence, especially all those historical cities we have across Southern Africa, right? The remains of these like Mapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe, and so on. And I mean, I understand from my limited understanding of how these work that pottery evidence is very crucial in how they're interpreted. So maybe it is just isn't that separate in a useful way. But yeah, if you have any thoughts, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, we haven't considered any other evidence. I also understand that pottery can be a bit problematic. One of the reasons we went into this is that archaeologists have stated with quite a lot of certainty that there must have been multiple migrations into Southern Africa carrying different Southern African Bantu languages on the basis of pottery findings. So we were just trying to add to that existing discussion, but you would have to do a much better survey of the archaeological literature and looking at different kinds of evidence in order to really resolve this kind of question. Also, in order to link it to these cities that you mentioned, see if we can figure out any kind of connection with linguistics there, which is obviously very problematic, linguistic and archaeological data. But yeah, we haven't even started to do that yet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how, yeah, so I understand your point about that, obviously, but there are also less famous ones, right, that have been specifically linked with Tswana. I think they're much more recent, so maybe that just makes it much easier to reconstruct that. But I mean, I hope at some point somebody does that research, even if I'm sure it's going to be difficult and maybe not fully conclusive either. But
yeah, I think there's those big Tswana cities from maybe the 17th, 18th, 19th century. So
I think so. Yeah,
some of
them are much more recent.
Yeah. So that's I think from the linguistic evidence, we can be pretty sure that Southern Bantu languages were well diversified by then. So we were looking at a much earlier period.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Any other questions or comments? Martin again? Oh, your microphone is on.
I have to unmute myself. Yes, I'm unmuted now. Thank you. Just a small remark first. Yes, I think this corroborates what Hilde said, that the innovation of these suffixes may easily have happened multiple times. There is a Nyihanzu, a Bantu language in central Tanzania, that has developed within the F30 group diminutive suffixes, as Andrew Harvey has shown that. So yeah, that's just a remark. I have a question that I think for myself it would be impossible, but maybe I'll try it on you. So you show this Bantu substrate in Nguni. You expect Bantu substrate in Shona. Is there any way to find out where, and maybe in separate places or in one place, this Bantu substrate happened?
You mean which Bantu language it comes from? Or?
No, I mean, was it one event in Zimbabwe, and then what we see now in Nguni is a reflex of this, or do we expect it to be also a Bantu community that's separate from the one in Zimbabwe that has influenced the Nguni languages?
Yeah, you're right. That's really difficult. Yeah, maybe it might be possible, but then we'd first have to, I think we're not even close to proving this kind of substrate yet. And then if we find substrate in individual languages, then we can start comparing it and see maybe if there are some similarities. So it has earlier been argued by Ownby working on Nguni that this Bantu substrate in Nguni was related to Shona, but I don't think that's right, because Shona similarities are actually very weak. But we might expect it to be similar in so if in our scenario, Shona would be the most likely place to find pre-Bantu in Bantu substrate. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, then let's thank Hilde again. This was really a fantastically interesting talk, and I think also a really nice discussion. So we're planning to read your paper actually also in our reading group. So maybe we'll send you more questions by email once we have read it properly. But thank you so much for your presentation this morning. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks everyone. It was very nice discussing this.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.